Hello, my name is Eva Guz and I'm a teacher, trainer and researcher at the Center on Foreign Language Teacher Training and European Education at the University of Warsaw. It's a great pleasure to be here today and take part in this year's edition of the European Day of Languages. The year 2020 has caused some dramatic changes in education across the world, essentially shutting down schools, moving lessons to online digital platforms and ultimately replacing traditional physical classrooms with home-based online learning. So this shift has had many benefits, but it has also posed significant challenges for teachers and educators. The goal of my talk today is to shed some light on those changes, especially with respect to teaching English as a foreign language. So let me first give you a quick overview of my talk today. I'm going to begin by discussing the general speaking abilities of Polish learners of English. Then I will move on to factors influencing speech production. In the third part of my talk, I would like to compare and contrast offline and online school environment. Finally, in the last part of my talk, I would like to focus on practical aspects and discuss some principles of teaching speaking and some practical tips for teachers. So to put this presentation in a wider and local context, I would like to discuss the speaking abilities of Polish learners of English. And the central question that we need to ask ourselves here is speaking English difficult for Polish learners? Are they good at it? Can they speak fluently? To provide answers to these questions, I would like to discuss two data sets. The first one includes a study conducted by the Institute of Educational Research among lower secondary students, and this study investigated the oral proficiency of Polish lower secondary learners in the last grade. The second data set that I would like to focus on are the results of the Matura exam, oral English Matura exam from the last 6 years. So the first BOOM study investigated 499 Polish lower secondary students in terms of their oral proficiency, and the goal of this study was to assign the proficiency level in terms of the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages to these students. Now, overall, the results of the study showed that the speaking competence of Polish lower secondary learners of English is rather low. If you take a look at the slide, you can see that nearly half of those students attained the A1 level of proficiency, suggesting that they are very basic users of English as a foreign language. 1/3 of the students attained the A2 level of proficiency, and only 25% of those students can be described as independent users of English, attaining B1 and B2 level of proficiency. The study was repeated 2 years later, in 2013, this time on a slightly larger population of students, 594 students. And the results obtained in the course of this study are strikingly similar because, again, 1/3 of students attained the A1 or A2 level, respectively, and 25% of the students were found or could be described as B1 or B2 level. One important finding of that study is that nearly 6% of those lower secondary students turned out not to be able to speak English at all because their level could be described as below A1. So what happens later? How about secondary school students? So here, I would like to take a look at the results of the Matura exam from the last 6 years, of course, excluding 2020, when the oral exams were cancelled due to the COVID pandemic. So if you take a look at the slide, you can see that the results are quite consistent. Across the 6 years between 2015 and 2019, the average score of a Polish secondary graduate on oral Matura English exam was about 70%. Now, it's important to note here that the 70% does not refer to the proficiency level, it's just a score that the students obtained during the exam. So all in all, it can be stated that the speaking abilities of the students are, well, not so advanced. Why is that so? Why is speaking such a challenge for Polish lower secondary and secondary students? To provide the answer to this question, I would like to now move on to the second part of my presentation, where I will be looking at some factors which determine speech production. So I have grouped those factors into 4 categories, and the first category includes psycholinguistic factors, and then psychological factors, social factors, and finally systemic factors. So I'm going to start discussing the psycholinguistic factors, which essentially have to do with the nature of speech production in any language. So what exactly happens in your brain when you speak any language? What happens can be actually described quite well using the metaphor of a circus performance. And if you take a look at this juggler, you can actually, and you think about what it takes to perform this kind of act, you will realize that he needs to be coordinating and completing a number of activities at the same time. To look at each pin that he's juggling and all of them at the same time, to coordinate hand movements, and actually to do that in time and space. Producing speech in any language is actually pretty much the same, because speech production can be described as a kind of cognitive multitasking, where the speaker has to juggle, like the performer, a number of activities at the same time. So first of all, the speaker needs to activate his cognitive functions to pay attention and to activate memory. Of course, the speaker needs to have something to say, and then he needs to plan how to say it. So relevant linguistic resources also have to be activated. And all this time, the brain needs to monitor the whole process of speech production. So this is quite a lot, and it's all happening under severe time pressure. So to use a different metaphor, we could say that speech production is a major workout session for your brain, because the brain needs to multitask under huge temporal and cognitive pressure. So now, to illustrate this process a little bit better, I would like to present now the model of speech production which was put forward by an influential psycholinguist, William Levelt, in 1993. Now, according to this model, the process of speech production consists of a number of stages, beginning at the pre-verbal stage, where the concepts or ideas become formulated in the conceptualizer. This is followed by 3 verbal stages, during which linguistic formulation takes place. And here, relevant words are selected. These words are put into logical sequences by adding grammar to them. And finally, the whole sequences need to be articulated using relevant phonetic sounds. And again, this whole time, the process is being monitored, because the speaker needs to pay attention not just to what he or she is saying, but also to the whole speaking situation, including the behavior of the interlocutor, and so on. So it's no surprise that this puts a lot of pressure on the speaker, and it would be interesting to ask how this whole pressure makes the speaker feel, especially when they're speaking a foreign language. And before I answer this question, I would like to compare the process of speaking your native language with the process of speaking a foreign language, using Levelt's model of speech production as a map here. So when it comes to the to the ideas, when we speak our mother tongue, well, we have all the necessary ideas, because we only communicate when we have something to say. This is completely different than in a foreign language classroom, where the learners do not choose the topics. The topics are imposed by the curriculum or by the teacher. and they cannot decide about the content of their speech. The same applies to the linguistic resources that the speaker has at his disposal. So when we speak a native language, we have all the necessary words, the necessary grammar, and the necessary sounds, because we have learned those in childhood. Now, when we speak a foreign language, these resources are limited. To give you one example, the vocabulary size of a native speaker, of an English-speaking native speaker, is about 20 to 30,000 words, compared to a C2 level foreign language learner. And here the vocabulary size is about 15,000 words. And the same applies to grammar. As native speakers, we have unconscious knowledge of grammar. We don't even realize we speak grammatically, whereas when we speak a foreign language, we have to consciously choose those structures and then try to apply the rules in practice. Not to mention the phonetic aspects of speech. As native speakers, we have mastered all the necessary phonetic features. In a foreign language, we struggle and we have difficulty with correct pronunciation. The monitoring when we speak our mother tongue is unconscious, is automatic. Now, in a foreign language, we're not able to monitor our own speech until we become quite fluent. So, putting all these factors all together, we can conclude that speaking a foreign language puts much more pressure on the speaker than speaking their native language, because, well, we have to remember that it all happens in real time under severe cognitive constraints. So there are some serious psychological consequences of this process, and I would like to move on now to the psychological factors which determine speech production. So one negative emotion that has been extensively researched in recent years in terms of foreign language speaking is foreign language anxiety. Foreign language anxiety is defined as a general, strong, negative emotional reaction to foreign language, and actually as many as 50% of foreign language learners report that they have experienced one of the forms of these emotions, and this might include communication apprehension, which is also known as speaking anxiety, fear of negative evaluation, and test anxiety. Now let me focus on communication apprehension, because this is the emotion that appeals most to the topic of my today's presentation. So communication apprehension, also speaking anxiety, is a specific type of anxiety which is experienced when a foreign language learner is faced with the need to communicate in a foreign language. This anxiety has quite severe physical symptoms because, it may lead to heart palpitations, trembling, and excessive sweating, dry mouth, or even losing the ability to speak. And it is accompanied by quite serious psychological symptoms as well, such as negative thoughts, low self-confidence, shame, humiliation, and loss of face. Now, what causes speaking anxiety? What are the reasons behind it? Well, first of all, we have to remember that when speaking a foreign language, the speaker typically feels a complete lack of control over the situation. There is very little time to plan or prepare. The speaker has limited linguistic resources, as we have seen, and this might lead to inability to express ideas or to this fear that the speaker is not going to be understood, or that he's not going to be able to understand others. So again, all of these factors put together increase the pressure on the speaker and make him feel anxious and uncomfortable when speaking a foreign language. So this is not the end of the complications, because we have to remember that we learn to speak a foreign language in the classroom, in a foreign language classroom, and this is part of the school. School is a community, and this means that when we speak a foreign language, we typically speak with and in front of others. Now, this means that foreign language speaking is a form of public speaking, because school is a public place. And essentially, this also means that speakers are constantly evaluated, monitored, and assessed, which gives rise to even more negative emotions. And finally, let me move to the last category of factors, the factors connected with the fact that foreign language lessons take place in a school, and school is a system which is governed by its own rules. So the factors that somehow complicate the speaker's situation here, first of all, include little or no emphasis on oral skills in the curriculum. There is no exam in speaking at the end of primary school. We only have one at the end of secondary school. The classes are rather large with many students, which limits talking opportunities. And also the classrooms are rather small, which means that the collaboration opportunities are also limited. Finally, the oral proficiency of teachers is well, sometimes insufficient, and students lack good speaking models. So, well, putting all these factors together, it is not surprising that speaking a foreign language is a little bit of a daunting and a scary task, and that it makes you feel like this. So, I would like now to move on to the next part of my presentation, in which I discuss the offline and online environment. So the basic premise of this talk was that, well, education has moved online, so perhaps the online environment is more convenient for speaking. So I would like now to compare the offline and online school environment, focusing specifically on the speaking opportunities that they offer to learners. So how are these two contexts different? In terms of speaking opportunities, of course. So I'm going to compare the physical classroom and remote learning in terms of this 7 criteria that you can see on the slide. So frequency of talking, the interlocutors, meaning who you talk with, motivation, the place, time, assessment, and emotions. So if we consider the traditional physical classroom, when it comes to the frequency of talking, it is quite low. English lessons take place 2 to 3 times a week. They're 45 minutes. And we have to remember that speaking practice is quite scarce. The interlocutors are teachers and peers. They're not native speakers. They're not chosen by learners, but they are physically present. The motivation may be varied, but typically it's quite low because, well, there is no real life purpose in the classroom communication, and the learners learn for learning's sake. This whole situation, speaking situation, is quite formal and, well, a little bit artificial, we might even say. Students can be asked to speak anytime when the teacher feels like it or when they are allowed to do it. And all this time they're constantly being assessed, and this assessment is quite direct. Now, this means that the emotions that accompany the process of speaking a foreign language in a traditional physical classroom may be mixed. They may be negative because there is this pressure of public speaking, which I mentioned earlier, but they also may be positive because, well, we have face-to-face interactions with our peers. Now, how about online? Now, when we focus on the speaking opportunities in the online environment, well, the situation is pretty similar, but it's a little bit more complex, I would say. So the frequency of speaking is more or less the same, but we have to remember that students can record their own speech samples and upload them for the teacher to assess later. The interlocutors, well, they're the same. They're teachers and peers, but we have to remember that they're not physically present, which might have some impact on the interactions. The motivation is also varied. The peers are not physically present, which might decrease interaction. And also the social isolation might be a little bit detrimental to communication. But on the other hand, the students take part in the lesson in the security of their own home, which might feel them a little bit more relaxed. Now, the place where the spoken interactions take place is informal. It's the home setting. And we could say that speaking occurs in a natural, relaxed situation, but without direct physical contact with peers. Again, when it comes to the timing, students can be asked to speak whenever the teacher decides to do that. They're also being constantly assessed, but because the teacher is not present physically, this assessment is more indirect. And finally, the emotions that accompany speaking a foreign language in an online environment, they also can be mixed. Well, they may be negative because of the lack of physical social interactions with peers and social isolation, but they can also be positive because the students are secure in their home setting and they might feel more comfortable. So if you come to think about it, we could say that the online environment is more psychologically favorable for foreign language speaking because the learners have more control of the situation, which allows them to develop their learner agency. They can themselves determine the pace of learning and, well, over time, adjust it to their own needs. There are fewer distractions because the students are in their own homes, so they can focus better and the ideas flow better. And finally, well, it has to be noted that this kind of learning requires a lot of self-discipline at the beginning, but over time it might allow the learners to develop more self-discipline. Now, if we consider the offline environment, well, definitely we could say that it's more socially favorable because, well, students take part in direct face-to-face interaction, which actually might be more conducive in terms of the willingness to communicate. They can develop a wide array of their communication skills. And generally speaking, we could say that all those social interactions are more diverse with more opportunities for group learning. So to conclude this comparison of the offline and online environment, we could say that both environments have their pros and cons. So what does it mean for foreign language teachers? How are they supposed to teach speaking? How are they supposed to make students speak? So I'm going to address this question in the last part of my talk, where I will be focusing first on the principles of teaching speaking in an environment, and then I will try to support them with some practical tips for teachers, as well as some examples of speaking tasks. So these are the 4 principles that, in my opinion, govern the teaching of foreign language speaking, both in the physical classroom, but also, well, in remote learning situations. Principle 1, fluency first, but also fluency over accuracy. Principle 2, foreign language speaking requires ideas. Number 3, foreign language speaking requires language. And finally, foreign language speaking tasks require adequate instructions. So let me now say a few words about each of these principles and try to illustrate them. So starting with the notion of fluency first. Fluency refers to how much a person says, essentially, and how smoothly it happens. So fluency is quite important in foreign language because, well, in order to communicate, you have to be fluent. And in this respect, we could say that speaking is a little bit like driving a car, because the more you do it, the better you get at it. So the more you practice speaking, the more automatized the speech production process becomes, and the easier it gets in the long run. So the useful tips for teachers here to implement this principle, they include, first of all, making time for speaking during each lesson, and also placing equal emphasis on speaking and other language skills and areas. As I said earlier, speaking very often gets neglected because it's not assessed at the end of primary school. It would be a good idea to repeat the same tasks, so to use task repetition to actually give students opportunities to rehearse the same speaking tasks without the pressure of new instructions or new activities. Now, moving on to the second part of this principle, here I would like to focus a little bit more on another aspect of language use, accuracy. So we said that fluency refers to how much a person says and how smoothly it goes. Now, accuracy is completely different because it's equivalent to language correctness. So it expresses how well you can speak. Now, correctness is not really the first priority, number one priority in learning to speak a foreign language, because actually to speak at all, we have to first of all become fluent. So if and when teachers correct spoken errors, they can actually interrupt the students, break their train of thought or their flow of speech, which in the long run might lead to some problems such as avoiding speaking or withdrawal from communication. Now, the goal of speaking is not really accuracy then, but comprehensibility and intelligibility, which actually refer to being understood. Now, useful tips for teachers here, well, first of all, let your students speak without any interruptions. Increase your wait time. Students sometimes need some more time to gather ideas. Avoid questioning students in front of the whole class. It has to do with those negative emotions connected with public speaking. And perhaps do not correct spoken errors, or at least not immediately. I think using delayed corrective feedback is a good idea. Now, to illustrate or perhaps to investigate in what way speaking tasks realize this principle, I would like us to take a look at two tasks: an information gap, which you can see on the left-hand side of the slide, and an interview. So if you take a look at the information gap here, the students are supposed to work in pairs. Each of them gets a slightly different version of the same picture. They're not allowed to show these pictures to each other. And the goal of the activity is to ask and answer questions in English in order to find a number of differences between these pictures. So essentially what students do here is they get the task done. They do not speak for the speaking's sake. Now, if you compare it with the activity on the right, the interview, here students are also supposed to work in pairs, but this time they get a number of questions and they're supposed to exchange their opinions with reference to the questions. The topic here in this task is recycling. To give you an example of question one, how much recycling do people in your country do? How much recycling do you do personally? Now, the problem here is that, well, some students might have opinions or experiences connected with recycling, but not all of them do, which means that they will be automatically excluded from this task and they won't have much to say. So we have to conclude that the kind of task illustrated here does not really promote fluency, and the information gap that I discussed earlier is much better in this respect. Now, let's move on to principle 2. And this is a little bit connected with what I was just discussing. And the principle here states that foreign language speaking requires ideas. In other words, if you have nothing to say, you are not going to speak in any language. So here, task content needs to be attractive for the students because it determines the degree of student motivation, and engagement. Of course, the visual content or the visual layout of the task should be attractive because its job is to grab and sustain attention. And also the cues for speaking or ideas for speaking should be represented visually. Now, students typically, well, they enjoy sharing facts from their personal life, but they don't always have opinions. So it is preferable to use task-based activities rather than discussions which require students to have opinions on topics. So the technique of personalization in which students discuss their opinions and share their experiences is the preferred way of working here. Now, the tips for teachers to implement this principle would be, well, first of all, if you're using a course book, and you're preparing a speaking task for your student, do the speaking task yourself. And if, as a teacher, you have nothing to say in response to this task, this means that your students won't either, and perhaps it's not a good idea to do this task. Do not discuss opinions, gather and share facts. And, well, do not ask students to speak for speaking's sake, but ask them, well, give them something to do, essentially. Now, I want to illustrate this principle using the examples, 3 examples of tasks from different course books. There is a questionnaire on the left, then an opinion-based task, and a role play on the right. And I would like to examine these tasks in terms of, well, whether they provide ideas, and if they do, well, to what extent. So in the questionnaire, the students are, they get a set of 15 questions connected with their sleeping habits, and essentially what they do when performing this task, they ask and answer these questions. So, well, all of us sleep, so students have some personal experiences and, well, they have ideas. Now, if we take a look at the middle task, the opinion-based task, here the situation is slightly different because here the students are asked again to work in pairs and exchange their opinions. The goal is to state whether they agree or disagree with some statements related to the life of their local communities and some social issues. So the statements that they are supposed to discuss are provided, but they do not really get any cues or arguments that they could use in their discussions. And finally, the last task I would like to discuss to illustrate this principle is a role play on the right. Again, students work in pairs here, and their job is actually to adopt an imaginary identity in a speaking situation and actually behave as if they were supposed to say something in this situation. As you can see in the slide, well, students get specific descriptions of those situations. So to conclude, we could say that the questionnaire and the role play are pretty effective in providing ideas, but again, the task in the middle, the opinion-based task, does not do a very good job at it because, well, if students don't have opinions, they're not just going to speak and the task is not going to be effective. Now, moving on to principle 3, this is connected with the aspect of foreign language speaking that I have already discussed. Namely, foreign language speaking, of course, requires language. And, well, the major challenge for foreign language speakers is lack of linguistic resources. So in order to speak, we need words, we need fixed phrases, we need to put those words and phrases into sentences using grammar. Of course, all of it needs to be pronounced. And then, of course, what we say has to match the speaking situation. So we have to know some kind of a model dialogue. So essentially, a good speaking task provides the necessary language, but also, well, the language should not just be discussed, but preferably displayed so the students can actually see it and use it whenever they run out of language. If your students struggle with speaking, it's a good idea to actually start with repetition and supply ready-made phrases for the students to use. And finally, I think it's not a good idea to assume, even if you're teaching higher levels of proficiency, that students actually know enough language to perform the task. It's always better to give them something, and it's better to be safe than sorry. So to illustrate how this principle can be realized in practice, I would like to show you 2 examples of pretty good speaking tasks which provide all the necessary language to the speakers. So let me start with the personal story on the left. It's a personal story about a close friend, and if you take a closer look at this task, it actually begins with listening to a recording where students listen to a person actually telling a story of their friend. So they are exposed to the model of the speech that they will later imitate. Then they have to reflect on the language by matching questions with answers. And finally, in the second part of the task, they are instructed to think about what they could say, then think about how they would say it, and finally, to discuss it with their partner. So, as you can see, at each stage of this activity, the students get support from the task. They get the relevant model, they get the necessary language, and what they have to do is just to put the cherry on the cake and speak. Similarly, the task on the right, making questions, this is a task for beginners. So the task, in this task, the students are supposed to make different versions of the "where are you from" question. And as you can see in the task, different versions of the question are provided and some visual cues with ideas are provided. Students' job here is just to adopt the questions or change the questions to match the situations. So again, the language is provided, the ideas are provided, and what the students, the beginner students, get to do here is just to repeat, but they get to choose the relevant questions and the relevant language. So we could say that both of these activities are quite successful in providing the necessary language. So let me now move on to another example, which is not so good. And unfortunately, there are quite a few of such tasks in our course books that provide very little linguistic support to students. So on the left, you can see the opinion-based task, which I have already discussed, but I think it's a great example of not providing relevant language, because here the students, well, they get to discuss their opinions on a topic. And if you take a closer look at this task, they are referred to a vocabulary bank, which is situated at the end of the book. So the language is provided, but actually is not displayed on the same page as the task. And I think it's quite likely students are not going to go to the end of the book and use those phrases. So in the second task, the role play, the situation is kind of similar. The students get cues, they get instructions on what identities to adopt, but they're not told how to start. Okay, so they might struggle with actually beginning to speak in this activity. Now, moving on to the last principle of teaching speaking, I would like now to focus on a slightly different aspect of speaking, not the content of speaking tasks, but the didactic aspects of them. So in this principle, it is stated that foreign language speaking tasks require adequate instructions. Now, by instructions here, I'm referring to the instructions which are delivered by the teacher, but also the instructions which are provided by the task in the course book. So, of course, the instructions delivered by the teacher should be as brief, clear, and logically sequenced as possible. The teacher should make it clear what the goal of the task is, and it is a good idea to support your instructions with body language and to check understanding, whether your instructions were understood. Now, of course, the major tip for teachers here is that, remember, in speaking tasks, it is the students who should be speaking, not the teacher, so your job is to speak as little as possible, and when instructing students, make your sentences quite short. So this might require preparing your instructions in advance. So I just wanted to illustrate this idea of not really adequate instructions by showing you two tasks from course books for lower secondary and secondary students. And here I'm referring to the verbal instructions that are provided by the task in the course book. And if you take a look at the problem-solving task on the left, you can see here that students are in fact instructed to look at the pictures and decide which three things are the most appropriate. And finally, they are also instructed to complete the dialogue. So if you come to think about it, at no point in this activity are they instructed to speak. They're instructed to think and then to write, to fill in the gaps in the dialogue, but they're not instructed to speak, which might be quite misleading. The task on the right, the story, is similar because here the students are told to think of a story from the past and then they're supplied with two questions. Now, neither of these activities provides the language or the ideas for the task, so this might be quite confusing and the instructions might make this task not really effective. So to sum up, if we take into consideration all these factors that I've just discussed, it appears that, well, the offline and online environment are not much different. And when it comes to teaching a foreign language, specifically speaking in a foreign language, it can be successfully taught in both environments as long as we're basing it on some principles. So that's it as far as I'm concerned. Thank you for your attention.